Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for listening. Today, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Matt Langley. Matt is the Global Head of Sustainability at CBRE, where he's been for around about the last 9 years. Prior to that, Matt has had a varied and successful career, including roles at Citibank and Shell. And today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we get asked about a lot by listeners, which is decarbonising supply chains and the complexities and challenges that come along with that. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Why should organisations care about decarbonising their supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one I think everyone needs to ask themselves. In fact, most companies will have the majority of their emissions actually in their supply chain. Most companies are very good at calculating their scope one, which is the fuels and refrigerants they use, and scope two, which is the electricity. And then scope three is this helpfully everything else category that is jointly owned by yourself and someone else. And most companies actually have the majority of the emissions in that scope three, and most of them have it in the supply chain. So Lego is a good example that they have 99% of their emissions in their supply chain.
Yeah.
And for CBRE, we had 99.8% of our emissions in our scope three, but a decent chunk was in the downstream because CBRE manages a huge number of real estate assets of clients, and that gets included in the downstream. So yeah, scope three being 15 different categories, it really is an everything else area.
Yeah, I think it would be very fair to say you're a kind of recognised expert on this topic. I was really interested to understand kind of how you came into focusing on this area. What's led you to this point in your journey on decarbonisation in supply chains?
It's a bit of a long story, Simon. A long time ago. So you have to go back 20 odd years. As I was getting into procurement, I was also interested in sustainability, and I was working for Shell. I'd worked in the renewable energy division in sort of 97, 98. And then in around 2001, 2002, I was in the Netherlands and was an internal consultant and was doing some work for them. And as I was running global tenders or supporting that, I was also trying to help some of the upstream African oil and gas leads around trying to do more from a community perspective. And I thought, this is great. I probably should be about early in my career and doing an MBA. And rather than doing that, I looked at Imperial College and started a Master in Science in Sustainable Development. And so thinking that would take me 2 years, but it took me 6 as I traveled around the world and stayed within procurement, but always had this interest in sustainability. And so when I was based in South Africa and was the category manager for retail, I worked on some labor human rights aspects. And then when I moved to Australia, I worked more on the environmental side, but it wasn't really until getting to CBRE and getting in this role that I managed all of the procurement technology, operations, risk, data, and communications and transformation that I quietly built what needed to be done to understand sustainability and supply diversity. And I didn't need to ask anyone. In fact, I did have some senior leaders saying, why are you wasting your time working on this? And I'm like, it's going to be important. And then CBRE caught up to where I was, and a couple of years later, in sort of 2021, 2022, to put a net zero commitment together and decided that they wanted to be a leader in sustainability. And they had 8 global work streams. And one of them was a green and diverse supply chain, which morphed into really on the green side, how do you decarbonize your supply chain? And on the diverse side, making commitments like CBRE spending $3 billion with diverse suppliers at a global level, and getting the $1 billion round table. And so those teams I was managing, then we sort of split it. And as we got more into the decarbonizing the supply chain and the challenges there, the more I handed over my previous responsibilities and really got knee deep into, well, how do you actually do this? And it took a bit of time and some thinking, and really that technology background was helpful. The procurement and category management background was helpful. The data was helpful, and the supply engagement and deploying technologies that to suppliers, really gave me a bit of an insight around what we needed.
And on that, Matt, for our listeners, it's quite a global audience, could you just give a kind of brief summary of CBRE, the type of business it is? You mentioned that scope 3 is a particular challenge. So it would be great to kind of just give a quick summary of that, but then a little bit about how you started to tackle this topic and what kind of things have you achieved thus far in your journey of trying to decarbonize that supply chain?
So CBRE is the largest real estate company globally. And so it's the largest developer of office and sites in the US, and it does residential in the UK. It really came out of a brokerage network around leases and transactions and capital markets. But then about, I don't know, 20 years ago, it started looking at facilities management. So, which is more than half of the business now. So it manages 7.2 billion square foot of real estate.
Wow.
And has all of the S&P 500 and top companies globally and manage their 1,000 buildings around the world. And so they then outsource all of that cleaning and security and repairs and maintenance and catering that the landlords need or the tenants need. So you can imagine a supply chain that then is quite diverse, being in 100 countries, and ends up being 130,000 unique suppliers and on about 40 billion of spend. And depending on what emission factors you use, it can range from 10 billion of emissions in the supply chain, or our latest number was 5.3 million tons of emissions.
Yeah.
And so the journey was an interesting one, and kind of the way in some ways I work was first getting this global role in 2018.
Yeah.
And starting asking, well, how much is our spend? And at that time, we didn't even know what the spend was. There was all of the top ERPs or finance systems CBRE has in multiple instances. And so it took about a year to actually pull all that data together and know, okay, we're now spending at that time about 25 to 30 billion. And then it's great for the category managers, and we kind of sliced it and diced it and worked that through. And then I'm like, well, how diverse is the supply chain? And so then you start kind of trying to get a baseline and going through that data. And then the next question, so that was in sort of 2019, and at the end of 2019, beginning of 22, we're like, well, how sustainable is the supply chain? And then we partnered with EcoVadis and started down the journey of getting our suppliers to register with EcoVadis and have that sustainability assessment. And then, running that global project, well, how much carbon is in our supply chain, and started using a very simple emission factor, the US EPA, EEIO emissions that came to about 8 million tons when we calculated that. And so adding this all to dashboards and being able to calculate all of that. And then quickly you find you hit problem statement number one, that even if you're ready to decarbonize, most of your suppliers are not. And so the research that we proved out, and Schneider Electric proved this out too, is like at least half, more like 60 to 70% of your suppliers won't have calculated their emissions. And those that have, 30% will have only calculated scope 1 and 2. And coming back to the CBRE and the Lego example, well, that's not much to be able to say you're going to reduce that. You really need to look at the scope 3. And then you find that of the 10% remaining, there's only about 2% that are really actually doing decarbonizing projects. And so being a B2B business, we needed to be trust but confirm. And it wasn't good enough to have these industry averages and rely on what the suppliers may be able to provide to us. We really need to confirm that. And so then you go, okay, well, look, I'll use my spend data and I'll use those industry averages. But yeah, again, that's not enough for clients and it's not enough for reporting. But then also, if you use industry averages, the only way to reduce your emissions is to spend less.
Yes.
So that's the problem statement number 2. So then you have to decouple your business growth and your spend increasing by getting the actual or primary emission data from your suppliers. And then you get back to problem statement number 1. And then you're okay, so I need to engage with my suppliers. I need to work through something. And then I talk about you hit problem statement number 3 is that often the accounts contact at your supplier, not the sustainability or the procurement lead. If you don't have proper relationships with your suppliers, you're not going to be able to engage properly and they're not going to understand all of this. So that really led us to realize that we needed a carbon accounting solution or a partner to work with that. And we looked around the world and we looked at all of the normatives and the Paris Phonies and the watersheds and the Microsofts and Salesforce and hundreds of them. And we found that there was only a couple that could really support suppliers to decarbonize and so measure their emissions where they are at that maturity level. So if they're mature and they've calculated it, you can scrape the data and pull it in. Where they're not mature, then they need to load up their spend information on those fuels or electricity and their purchases. And then that partner can calculate it for them and then be able to do that.
Sorry to interrupt. Just for people who may not be so familiar with this, I think our listeners are largely procurement people, so I'm sure the term carbon accounting is something that they've heard. When we talk about carbon accounting, what is it that we actually mean, and what is different to carbon accounting to, you mentioned EcoVadis or other solutions? What's the specifics about carbon accounting in the way you use that term?
Yeah, it's really, and some people get challenged with this. It's looking at the seven greenhouse gases and saying carbon dioxide is the most common one. And so rather than saying greenhouse gases all the time, you just say carbon emissions.
Yep.
And it is singular. Like a lot of people, if you want to go and complicate things even further, you talk about the 9 planetary boundaries. And carbon is one of those, and you've got nitrogen and biomass and a whole bunch of others. But it's really getting it singular down to one thing or one common aspect around what are your carbon emissions. And if you look at a EcoVadis, then within their sustainability assessment, they look at the environment, labor, human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement.
Yeah.
And so that is broad, and they look at the management systems, solutions, and commitments that have been made and do an assessment of that, which is great. And then there's also other reporting solutions out there like the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and then you've got Science-Based Targets Initiative, where companies commit to making a science-based target reduction. All of these things are a big step if you don't know what carbon is and haven't started on the journey.
Yeah.
And what EcoVadis has worked through in a research paper a couple of years ago was that it takes 5 years for companies to go from a low maturity, a low understanding of their environmental, social aspects to being a high maturity. And that starts working through if you're making net zero commitments as a company by 2040 or 2030, 25, you've got to factor in your supplier, your first tier of suppliers needing 5 years to get mature, the next tier of suppliers needing 5 years to mature, the next one coming through.
Yeah.
So it is, you start realizing that you need to collaborate at scale across a large supplier base, especially if you have indirect procurement, which is all of the purchasing that CBRE does.
Yeah.
If you're buying tons of glass or tons of cocoa or tons of wheat or something else, like a Heineken is a good example, then they have 100 suppliers they need to engage to work through that. And most big pharma have like 300 to 500 that represent 80 to 90% of their emissions. For CBRE, was 90% of the emissions came from 7,500 suppliers. So we had a much different challenge around collaboration, engagement, and supporting the suppliers than some of those manufacturers or FMCG companies that are buying a lot more raw materials, or they have a shorter supply chain of a couple of tiers. The supplier is the farmer versus CBRE. Would buy steel, but would buy it through a wholesaler who buys it from a manufacturer who then buys it from a miner, and it's longer. And concrete and laptops are a good example that they have 10 to 12 tiers or levels of supply chains to be able to create one.
Yeah. You talked about the problem statements that you had at CBRE. You talked about the implementation of the carbon accounting solution to try and move the agenda forward. I'm interested in terms of, well, probably a couple of questions. One, what you've learned from that journey. You're ahead of an awful lot of other organizations. If you were doing it again, what are your major learnings? And I guess, what is there still to achieve in this topic, right? I guess there's lots still to be done.
Yeah, there is. I think the learning that I've had is really you go through and you hit a roadblock and you solve that roadblock and then you go through to the next one.
Yeah.
If you try and think through planetary boundaries and everything you need to do, you're just going to get stalled and you'll spend a lot of time doing analysis and trying to work through. So you need to go through that process. And you need partners to do it. A supplier is not going to give you their spend and all of the confidential information related to that directly to you.
Yeah.
Why would you? And a supplier is not going to suddenly just miraculously be able to calculate their emissions if they are low maturity. So you need to meet where they are. You need partners along this process. We've got a great partner with EmitWise, really that global view and all market analysis and running proof of concepts and everything else, then we have a good partner there.
Yeah.
And what I realize now is that the carbon accounting side of being able to calculate the emissions in your supply chain, we've been able to prove out how to do it. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of time, and there's a shitload of education of clients, education of internal teams, education of suppliers. But the road is clear there. So people that are looking at this saying, I don't even know how to calculate your emissions. Well, it's a fairly clear road. You go and you get decent spend, use industry average emission factors to kind of get you started. And that doesn't take very long to be able to pull that through. I ran a sustainable procurement pledge Scope 3 session with Climatic, and they have free good emission factor that you can use. And then you can get your hotspots, you start engaging with these suppliers, but quickly you need that partner to look at your emissions at a transaction level and really support your suppliers going through. So really, if you say that's pillar one now, the data, then well, what's next? Well, pillar two is that you really have calculated potentially for the first time, more than half the time for the first time, an emission footprint for your supplier. And then there's a so what test. This is where I worked with Emitwise and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Climate Drive, basically a decarbonizing database of different initiatives that they're creating with a little bit of Gen AI thrown in. Will personalize like a top 10 initiatives that supplier should work on. So now imagine you've got, okay, well, yep, this is what my emissions are in scope 1, 2, and 3. Here's top 10 I need to work on. And then that Gen AI will create a decarbonizing playbook and business cases and be able to really help create that internal documentation that you'd need. And if you think of that as sort of the second pillar that then the suppliers got a list of initiatives they need to work on and business cases to give their CFO. Pillar 3 then is, well, how do we have green financing solutions to move from combustion engine to electric vehicles for your fleet, or to electrify your manufacturing plant, or to use renewable energy, or to engage with your suppliers, support them on renewable energy solutions as well. And then also an ecosystem of consultants that can help you do energy audits and refine things through. So that's really what I'm working with now with Emitwise on, is that pillar 2 and a bit more on that pillar 3. Interestingly, when you again you hit challenges each way, and green financing to me has always been, well, the banks would go and support the companies to do green investing. It actually comes more across as trade financing.
Right.
That's not green financing. And so now you're trying to work with banks and say, no, we want to support our suppliers to invest in green solutions. They're like, well, would CBRE finance them? And then they pay back CBRE. No, we don't want to get involved in that admin and all that.
Yeah.
But the banks don't either.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So that's the latest kind of roadblock. That like, okay, let me focus back onto the business cases and the decarbonizing database, because that's kind of the biggest challenge at the moment. But yeah, once we get past pillar 2 and that pillar 3, building out that ecosystem, then we'll be able to provide any small to medium-sized enterprise and large ones too, which are very good at execution, right? But don't have the time and effort to create the strategies and learn all this stuff. That footprint, that business case, and the playbook, and then the support to be able to execute on it if they can't do it themselves, then we really should speed this decarbonizing process up.
Yeah. One of the things I was really interested to get your perspective on as well is, I don't hear it talked about too much, is the kind of, I guess, the commercial implications of this topic, right? So you've talked about the work that you've done, but it's clearly complicated, difficult, relatively expensive to implement, and therefore I assume commercially carries a cost for the organization choosing to do it. I'm just intrigued. Some organizations seem to be ahead, some organizations don't. Like, I'm just interested in your perspective on the commerciality of organizations pulling the trigger and investing the money to make this happen, and how and when that should happen. And is there even a risk to some companies of doing this and creating a competitive advantage for others from a cost perspective?
Yeah, there's absolutely an opportunity here and a risk that, and I think that the key for a company is to think about the timing, because you've got a lot of these B2C companies and B2Bs like CBRE that are driving the requirements through their supply chain. You invest too early and you might have a stranded asset that isn't required, or the technology might move. You invest too late and your competitors have already got that competitive advantage and you're losing out. So there is definitely that risk around the timing of the investments and when you do that. I think the other part that I want to highlight, though, because there is this perception that if I invest in a sustainable product, then it's going to be more expensive. And if you look at like solar prices now, solar as an energy source is less expensive than coal. It's got other issues around, like you can't hook it up to the grid fast enough, or if you're a data center owner, that you can't like put solar cells across all of Australia because you need that amount of energy. But you've got like opportunities coming through. And the other aspect that I like around the sustainable development training I did, or the Masters in Science I did 20 years ago, when I was a category manager, I used to overlay sustainability in there. And sustainability is about doing more with less.
Yeah.
And so you bring in that lens of like, well, how can I rationalize and standardize the requirements? Or how can I simplify the product or service I'm asking for? How do I build this in a different way? And I think the key, what I see in the future, is that category managers shouldn't be thinking, okay, I'm going to go and come up with a strategy for my category, let's say packaging or something like that, and just look at that and say, okay, I've got this many suppliers in the market and I'll go and run an RFP and I'll choose the standard requirements to come through, and then like job done, there's my category strategy, and I'll just kind of map things out and keep updating every couple of months. If you've done 3 or 4 rounds of negotiations and RFPs with those same suppliers, you're not going to get much more coming out. Category managers, in my mind, need to become thought leaders and need to look at the value chain and say, what is the first tier, second, third, fourth, fifth tier in my supply chain, and the clients or customers that want that, and get them all in a room and run a hackathon around, well, how do I simplify all of that? And what if the client changes the requirements a little bit, and then that can flow all the way through. And at CBRE, there's loads of examples like that. The ionized water on site that you can use rather than bulk chemicals is 20% cheaper than using those big plastic bottles with all those harmful chemicals, bleach and things. But no one really has the conversation with the client saying like, well, if you can work with us a little bit and get your HSE team happy that you're not using this heavy bleach, which is not particularly good for humans, but does make everything clean, and use ionized water, then you save money by 20%. And by the way, there's a massive reduction in your carbon emissions from it. But you don't have those conversations, right? There's not that collaboration, not that discussion. And so there are huge amounts of opportunities available. That what I've seen over the 20 years of doing this, though, that there isn't a $100 saving you can do. There's $101 savings that you make. And I think that's where the challenge is, that there's no silver bullet. You have to do 3 or 4, 10 things all at once and make those changes and have those discussions. And then that leads to the savings and the carbon emissions. And also, often you can get a social or diverse enterprise to support you on this as well. And you get a better product or service coming out of it.
Matt, just conscious of time, so this will probably be my last question. Just depending on how you look at it, if you look at the media on any given day, it feels sometimes that there's a sense that the topic of decarbonisation, climate change, carbon is somewhat softening in terms of the global agenda at a political level. Do you think that's fair? Do you see that in your day-to-day work? What's your view of the future on this?
I think the media, we all get interesting bias coming from the States. Where ESG has become toxic, in that the Republicans have pulled it out and said like, okay, that's my next thing I want to go after. And the reason why the Silicon Valley Bank went under was because they had a ESG report. That's why, not that they had governance issues. It was because they had environmental aspects. And so, CBRE is a Dallas headquartered organization. So I'm sensitive to that. And I do see it. And that we've changed the wordings from ESG isn't really used within CBRE. And a lot of people now, it's now sustainability. To kind of move some of that through. But I think we all kind of see that and feel that coming in. If you look at, though, the the regulations in California, in New York City, especially in Europe, in India, in Canada, in Australia, all these countries are actually coming up with these regulations. And the CSRD is a good one that it's about corporate reporting that you need to do if you're a reasonably large organization in Europe. And a lot of American companies are being caught by that as well. And so they need to report on it. And I guess, I'm a huge Peter Drucker fan. What gets measured gets managed, and that's starting to come through. What people don't realize, though, is that the CSDDD, which is around the basically, what is it? Can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it basically makes you responsible for your supply chain from an environmental and social and human rights aspect.
Yeah.
So if you're responsible for that, it's not just about reporting, it's about you actually acting and doing something there. And those two regulations actually connect. So it's not many people realize that if you get covered by CSRD, then you're going to have the CSDDD, and then you're going to actually have to do things. So at this top level, then you're seeing all this media reporting about it and politicians talking about it. But at a company level, everyone's getting on and just working it through and trying to figure stuff out. And so I don't see, it's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And what's getting more important or more interesting is that people are actually realizing the size of the challenge on the data side, on that supplier engagement side, on their education. And that's where you're seeing some of these companies roll back around their 2030 commitments, because there's no way that they're going to be able to meet them. And they've got in and they've made these commitments. Now they've figured out just how big it is, and they're walking it back. And so it looks bad. All these companies are walking it back. But actually, they're still investing and they're still scaling up on it.
Matt, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really interesting conversation. Fascinating. Learned a lot about a topic I think is really important, right? And it's talked about more and more in our industry. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics, or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.